Starfield is probably one of the most awaited games this year, which is why I want to talk about what the system requirements are and what the game is probably going to really require, because those two things are something very different, and I especially think that it is the case in Starfield because it's so big. Starting out, what is Starfield? Or rather, most of you probably know what Starfield is, but the point is that Starfield is a very big open world, and this is the reason why the minimum system requirements, or rather the system requirements in general, are probably a little bit on the, well, not conservative side, but the other way around. Looking at the world size and some of the other games that have huge or big open worlds and are similar in genre to this, like Star Citizen, those games require a lot of hardware power. Yes, since Starfield is made by Bethesda and it is made by a big studio obviously, and therefore the performance optimization is going to be much better than with something like Star Citizen, it is still going to require some high-end hardware to run properly. What I mean with this, the minimum system requirements of a Ryzen 2600X with a RX 5700 are, although a good starting point, I would suggest if you do have a Ryzen 2600, then you might be looking at 30, maybe even less FPS, because in an open world it kind of is the problem is kind of that the CPU power is the thing that restricts the power the most, because you can always kind of reduce the resolution and you can reduce details and run the game on a relatively slow graphics card, like in this case an RX 5700, which is not really that slow or old, but I bet you could run it on even an older card. The problem though would be that you probably won't be able to run it on an older CPU and should be looking at a newer CPU, which is going to be at least a 2700X or a 5600X, because those CPUs have a lot more power and can handle large open worlds a lot better, since they are either clocked higher, have a much newer architecture, as well as having more cores. At least that's the case in the 8-core 2700X. You could obviously overclock 2600 or 2600X, but the problem is on those, they don't really overclock as well as the newer chips, and for Intel that is kind of the same thing. The equivalent would be a 10400F, for example, which is also 6 cores and 12 threads, but that is not overclockable. So I would at least recommend an overclocked 10600K at least, or a 10700K for the extra benefit of the 2 more cores. And yeah, the CPU I think is going to be the bottlenecking factor in any of the Starfield gaming, because this is just the reason why this game could run slower than with other hardware. The next thing is you should probably obviously take a look at is the RAM, because yes, although 16 gigabytes might get you into the game, I don't think that with 16 gigabytes you might get good performance, because with worlds that large, 32 gigabytes or at least throwing another 8 gigabytes, so 2x4 into the mix, it will probably be a much better experience, because having too little RAM results in laggy gameplay, because the RAM has to be, well, basically offloaded to your SSD, and if you don't have a really fast SSD like a PCI Express 4.0 M.2, this is going to really slow this all down. And even if you do, it's still going to decrease the performance, and maybe you'll have issues with the world not loading properly or whatever. Next up, the GPU level. Although yes, with the 5700 they recommend an 8 GB card, although we have seen in many games nowadays that 8 GB is not really enough, or not really enough for very demanding titles, and you will get to the limits, but on most cases you will be okay when reducing settings, especially texture quality or shader quality. But in Starfield, I would guess, also because of the big open world, that you might run into problems with 8 GB. The GPU power might not be as big of a problem because you can just reduce the resolution, or probably the rendering resolution, because FSR 3 is going to be present, but the problem will probably be the VRAM, and that will going to limit you in most cases. This is why I would recommend at least an RTX 3060 or a 2080 Ti, which has 11 GB. So I just choose a graphics card with more than 10 or 11 GB, so that you are on the safe side, because even with 1080p we have seen a lot of games going over that 8 GB mark and even over 9 GB sometimes. And this is not going to be different with Starfield. I think it's going to be even worse, especially when exploring the world more. There is going to be some parts of an old area stored in the VRAM, so the VRAM usage might increase over your playtime over 1-2 hours, and then you might have problems with either textures not loading in properly, so they're looking like pretty much rubbish, and then later on maybe even having performance issues, although that's probably only going to happen later if you're not running too high settings. Another word on the tech on Starfield is, obviously, as I said before, FSR 3 is going to be in the game, although for Nvidia cards DLSS 3.5 is not going to be there yet, although Nvidia users are also free to use AMD's FSR. So if you want to get some more performance, then FSR 3 is the way to go, although I would strongly recommend keeping it at a maximum of the quality settings, because even there the resolution is halved. So yeah, even this can look a bit worse than the actual resolution that is set, and going to balance the performance, yeah, the image quality is going to suffer, and I would only recommend that if you really need to, and the better option would be reducing the settings somewhat. Ray tracing is also not going to be in the game, and the reason for that is probably because implementing it in that big of a world is kind of complicated, but screen space reflections and global illuminations have gone that good nowadays that you don't necessarily need it. Yes, it looks better, but it will still look good without it. That's something to be said there. The only thing is that you might get some not as realistic behavior of shadows, of reflections and of lighting, but I think that's not that big of a deal, especially because ray tracing obviously costs still a lot of performance, which many of you probably should be investing in higher frame rates or just turning up the settings more. In general, from the gameplay we saw before, Starfield should look pretty good, and everything we've seen so far looks pretty promising. The only issue I see is that for consoles, they are probably not going to hit the 60 FPS mark everywhere, and are going to be limited to 30 or something between 30 and 60 in most of the scenarios. So maybe there's a performance mode where the frame rate is unlocked, so that you at least have 40 FPS, because the CPUs of the consoles are pretty weak compared to a high-end PC, so that might be an issue for the console players. Otherwise, yeah, as I said, it looks pretty exciting, and if you want to see more Starfield content, let us know in the comments below, and what you want to see or what we should cover. And otherwise, I wish you a nice day. Goodbye.